Welcome to today's event, which is co-sponsored by the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies and also by Latina Studies. And also special thanks to Silvia Petrasa, who is a professor in sociology and American culture, for giving the initial input for this event. Without her, it probably wouldn't have happened. I mean, it would have been our loss, obviously. So I'm Dario Gaggio, the director of the Center for European Studies and European Union Center. And before I introduce today's speaker, let me draw your attention to a couple of upcoming events. Next Thursday, the current Netherlands visiting professor, Madeleine Hosley, will give a talk titled The Importance of Actor Cleavages in Negotiating a European Constitution. And then the following week, so October 14, Thursday, same place, same time, we will be welcoming this year's distinguished speaker on Europe, Desmond Dienen, who will be speaking to us about an imperfect union understanding European integration. So I hope to see at least some of you at these events as well. So today we have the pleasure and the privilege to be welcoming Jose Moya. He was born in Cuba, and he had a very international, intercontinental education and life, right? He's lived in many different places, and he holds a PhD in history from Rutgers University. He taught at UCLA until 2005, when he moved to New York City. He is now professor of history at Barnard College, where he also directs the Forum on Migration. He's published an award-winning book, a groundbreaking book, many awards also, titled Cousins and Strangers, Spanish Immigrants in Buenos Aires, 1850-1930, for University of California Press. And he's the editor of Latin American History and Historiography, which is about to come out, or maybe it has come out in the meantime, I don't know, for Oxford University Press. Or maybe we should check, right? Or maybe any day, any moment now. So in addition, of course, to many articles and book chapters that, too many to mention. He's been visiting professor in France, Argentina, and Spain, and has been awarded many fellowships and grants, again, on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, on both sides of the Panama Canal, if that's a boundary, I don't know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. And Professor Moya is an international authority, no question about it, on migration studies in particular, but his opinions on migration, but also on other matters, from the appointment of Sonia Sotomayor to the future of Cuba, are routinely sought by the press and the media more generally. He's now working on a social and cultural history of anarchism in Buenos Aires at the turn of the 20th century, again, in its ramifications on both sides of the ocean. So we're really excited to have him here today, also because almost on the side, it seems, he's been reflecting and researching on migration from Latin America to Europe, which is a topic on which there is very, shamefully little, I think hardly anything at all in English, at least I think, despite its obvious relevance and importance. So, and his talk for us today is aptly titled Latino Immigrants in Europe, or as you can see, it's changed a little bit. So please welcome Jose Moya.
Well, thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks especially to Sylvia, who invited me several times and it was quite complicated. It became Byzantine, but she persevered, and that's why I'm here. And thanks for Dario for welcoming me here. I hadn't worked on Latinos in Europe at all. It was just an idea that I said, well, that's an interesting topic. I have been in Spain. I have seen it with my own. I spent a summer in Germany last year, and then I realized that there were Latinos all over the place. And then says, well, this is intriguing. So I hope that out of this, at least an article will come. But what I'll do before getting to the Latinos, I wanted to examine a little bit the transition of Europe from the major exporter of people in the planet, of migrants, of immigrants, to the major importer of people also in the world. That's actually a quite a drastic transition. And then I had this PowerPoint thing here, and I don't know how to. Well, oh, there we go. It's just. Is it visible, or should we turn the lights a little bit?
Yeah, we will turn.
So I wanted to begin. I mean, there were European out-migration before this, obviously, I guess, to Iceland and Greenland and Canada. But I mean, this is when the out-migration begins significantly. You can see that there were close to 3 million European immigrants who left Europe during the early modern period. More than 90% went to the Americas. It's only a few that went in the 18th century to Siberia, but the Philippines, very few went. Indonesia, very few went. So it's basically mostly the Americans. This was not, however, the most important source of long-distance immigrants during the early modern period. It was actually Africans. Before 1800, more than 3 times as many Africans have left Africa, almost forced. This is basically the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave traffic. And then there is less than 1 million trans-Pacific and Indian Ocean migrants moving around. But things were going to change in the next wave, the first wave of global migration, let's say from the 1840s, I don't know, the end of the Napoleonic Wars to the World Depression of 1930. And then we have some other figures here. And now what we can see is that Europeans did become the most mobile people in the planet by far. During this period, actually, at the beginning of this period, Europeans made up 18% of the population of the world, but they accounted for 54% of long-distance mobility. A lot of it is actually, I was surprised to find this out. This was a work that I did with a colleague of mine, Adam McCune. And we were surprised to find so much internal long-distance migration within Europe. This doesn't include short-distance rural to urban migration. This is long-distance, meaning more than 1,000 kilometers. And in the case of Europe, that big number there, 74 million, is mostly, well, it's just about everyone. Irish going to the UK, Southern Italians going to Northern Italy, Northern Italians crossing the Alps, Poles and other Eastern Europeans going to Germany and to France, all sorts of mobility in Scandinavia and the North Sea, rural migration and colonization in Ukraine and Russia. But Europeans also left. And you can see that, 73 million left Europe during this time. The difference between, the predominance of Europeans among long-distance migrants is even more pronounced, and I'll show you now, among settlers. And I wanted to, these are the 3 main sources in the world during the time of out-migrants, right? Europe, China, and India. And you can see that Europeans make up, 74% of all immigrants. Now, the next slides show you I'll show you this slide. The number, when this was over, this long century of migration, circa 1950, the number of Europeans or Euro descendants that resided out of Europe, there was 204 million. Let's call them whites in short language. Europeans or Euro descendants out of Europe, but look at the number of Indians and Chinese. Basically, my question was, why are there no Chinese United States or Indian Argentinas and Australias? Or even, Uruguay, a Chinese Uruguay. Oh, there is a Chinese Uruguay, I guess. Singapore is the closest thing. And the explanation for this rare phenomenon was, let me see if I have the explanation here. No, I don't have the explanation, so I'll tell you. The explanation is that Europeans began emigrating earlier, significantly earlier during the early modern period. And those early people count a lot in terms of settlement and reproduction, right? So a very early migrant in terms of reproduction counts like 4 or 5 times what a later migrant will count. And the other thing that made the difference is that European migration was much more feminine. Overall, in the colonial period, we're talking about 25% female before 1800. After 1800, in the 19th, early 20th century, we're talking about close to 40%. By comparison, Indian and Chinese migration was consistently over 90% male. And when the proportion of women began to increase was in the 1920s and 1930s, very late to reproduce the population. These are the destination of European immigrants during this period, and I give it by countries. But in reality, we're talking about a major transference of global population that has a very strong ecological component, which is actually more important than nation states. If you look at it at the bottom, the proportion of all European immigrants during the period that went to temperate zones, that is, zones with European-like climates, is 97%. I think Cuba is the only exception of a country in the tropics that receive a significant number of immigrants, right? So this is basically a huge transference of population from the regions in the temperate belts of the planet with the highest density, the highest ratio of people to land, to the regions, the temperate regions of the planet with the lowest density, the highest proportion or ratio of land to people. That also created actually a tremendous explosion in economic growth. And I think the next slide will illustrate that. This is where the so-called Pomeranz, Ken Pomeranz call it, the big divergence, the great divergence. I agree with my friend Ken Pomeranz that there was a great divergence, but I think it's a little later than it began when he studied in the late 18th century and early 19th century. But you can see that the big gap between what we call today the West and the rest in this developed during this period. And the top line is what I call what is it that I call them? Anglo Neo-Europes. That will be the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. The blue one or the green one is Latin Neo-Europes. That's Argentina and Uruguay. I would have included Brazil, but the problem with Brazil, that is only southern Brazil, that is of European receiver of European immigrants, and I couldn't find regional data, only national data. And then Europe itself. And in this case, you can see how this was a symbiotic system in which both senders and receivers benefited. This is GDP per capita. On the other hand, the other major migration systems, the ones in Southeast Asia, neither the senders nor the receivers benefited. You can see how GDP more or less stay flat. The only exception there will be a blimp, and it's Malaysia and Singapore. But other than that, this is where the first and the third world were taking shape. And my argument is that to understand capitalist development and modernization and modernity during the 19th century and the big gap or divergence, you need to understand the migration. I mean, migration is essential in this process, and it's basically an integrated circulation not only of people but of capital, commodities, technologies, ideas, practices, from labor unions to savings to banks, ideologies from anarchism to liberalism, well, even to left-wing Catholicism, if you will, and all of this. So this is basically the first integrated and convergent economic, semi-global economic system. What happened then in 1930 after the World Depression? What we see is a shrinkage of both the liberal world system and also of transnational circulation, both of people, but also of trade, capital investment, So it's actually, you could call it a mercantilist renaissance. Right? After a century and a half of liberalism, you have a search for autarky again, and controls of people moving, but also controls of trade and tariffs and things like that. So then, what happened during the post-World War II? And what we find here is actually a renewal of immigration out of Europe. Some people don't remember this, but in the 40s, the 50s, and into the 60s, what is the richest countries in Europe were still emigrating. There is a huge outflow of Germans and even Brits during the late 40s and 50s, and Dutch, and so it's the most developed countries in Europe. Now they stop emigrating. That's true in the 60s. By the 70s, they're not out migrating anymore. But then the poorer European countries continue to do so. And in the case of Portuguese and I don't know, Greeks and people like that, they were still migrating in the early 80s. So we see in the post-war period a renaissance of a renewal of out migration from Western Europe to the old destinations, the United States, Canada, Argentina, and a new one actually, Venezuela, during the oil boom. A lot of Portuguese, Italians, and Spaniards. And then what you see during the same period is actually little immigration out of Eastern Europe because of the communist regimes. The exceptions are few. Hungarians in 1956, and then Soviet Jews to Israel during the détente period, right? But very little immigration out of Eastern Europe, which had been actually a big, an increasing source of immigrants up to the 1920s. And then from the 50s to the 70s, you see also the growth of south to north intra-European immigration. Those are, Southern Europeans basically going north, Portuguese, Greeks, Yugoslavians. Yugoslavians actually were the exception to the communist bloc. Yugoslavians were migrating actually during the time of Tito. And that basically stops by the 1970s, late 70s, early 80s, and disappears. And then in post-1980s, after 1989, you have a reversal of the West-East pattern. After by the 1980s, Western Europeans are not out-migrating anymore, but Eastern Europeans now begin migrating en masse. And I think Russia for a while was the second country of immigration in the world after Mexico. It was also the second the second country of immigration because people coming from Central Asia and the Caucasus. So the next stage is how Europe became a continent of immigrants from the 1950s to the present. I think the earliest immigrants, non-European immigrants into Europe that I found were actually West Indians, Jamaicans, Trinidadians, who began migrating to the UKs. And very early, right after the war in the 1950s, they continued to go, but not as much as in the 1950s as a peak. Then they're followed in the UK by South Asians, particularly Pakistanis and Indians. Bangladeshis were not migrating then. You also have Algerians to France, Turks to Germany, Surinamese to the Netherlands, Moroccans to Spain and the Netherlands, and other groups. By the 1980s, you begin to see now sub-Saharan Africans, Chinese, Bangladeshis, and Latin Americans. By the early 20th century already, Western Europe is the major receiver of immigrants in the world. It surpassed the United States. 21 to 22% of all international migrants in the world today go to Western Europe. The figure for the United States is 20%. So Western Europe has surpassed the United States as a destination for migrants. The Latin American presence in Europe, well, it's very old in small numbers. There is always the figure of Indianos. Indianos are the returnees. Sometimes they're also called Americanos. And this figure of the Indianos and their offspring that were born in Latin America during colonial times and they were taken back to Europe appear is a leitmotif in Golden Age Spanish literature. And it continues to be so, actually. Most of them were children of Spaniards, but they were also people of mixed racial origins. And a famous, at least for me, who is an opera lover, is La Forza del Destino. I don't know if you remember that in La Forza del Destino is about a Peruvian of mixed racial origins living in Seville and the problems with, well, discrimination and resentment and all of that. You also had students from colonial Spanish America going to Madrid to study, to Salamanca. That was even truer of Brazilians, because colonial Brazil didn't have a university. So all the upper class had to go to Coimbra, actually. And so all Brazilians were educated in Coimbra in Portugal. So there is all of those connections, and many of them stayed. Military officers also that were going to Spain during the colonial period, including most of the liberators. The people who fought against Spain, actually, Bolivar, San Martin, and the people who were not military officers but fought against Spain, José Martí, the Cuban José Martí. When the next group that I find, and then the children of immigrants become more numerous in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, when Spanish and Portuguese migration to Latin America becomes massive. We're talking about 2-3 million people. The next group, the other group that I found is from the Belle Epoque on, actually. Bohemians, literati, painters. If you look at the biographies of all of the famous Latin American painters, for example, they all were in Europe or lived in Europe for a long time, whether it's the Mexican Diego Rivera or the Cuban Wilfredo Lam or the Argentine Mata or the Uruguayan Torres Garcia. Just look at the biographies. It's constant. And then the simply rich. There was actually large communities of Latin America in 1900, 1910 in Paris, about 15,000 of them. Most of them were from the richer countries, or richer people from the poorer countries. And the majority probably Argentines. Actually, the phrase rich as an Argentine became a common phrase, a common expression in the French language during the early 20th century. These were the Argentines of the early 20th century in France, were the equivalent of what the Gulf Kingdom sheikhs were going to be in the 60s and the 70s with the petrodollars. After those people, the first significant in numbers besides Bohemians and literati and artists are the Cuban exiles that begin to live for Spain specifically in the 1960s. They're followed by another group of exiles, Chileans and Argentines in the 1970s. And then from the 1990s, particularly from the middle of the 1990s to the present, basically everyone, except what I call the U.S. loyalists. And the U.S. loyalists are Mexicans who are unidirectional in their migration. They only come to the United States, and Central Americans. They don't go to Canada. Well, there are actually a few Salvadorians in Canada, but very few. So their loyalty to the United States as a destination should be rewarded instead of trying to keep them out with the Arizona and stuff like that. This is the only people who only want to come here, actually. So, now, the Latino immigrant population in Europe by today, well, it's probably not 2010, but 2009, the latest that I could find, it's more than 2 million people, to 2.25 million people. These are foreign-born, not their children, or there are not that many second-generation immigrants. The majority are in Spain, as you can see, but there are significant numbers in Italy, UK, Germany, Portugal, France, just everywhere, Austria. And then what I wanted to go over are the major traits or characteristics of this 1990s plus wave. One of the characteristics is that this is truly a wave. I mean, that metaphor in migration studies is constantly used, and sometimes we really are talking about trickles or streams rather than waves. So it's overused, that term wave. In this case, it is truly a wave. The number of Latin Americans in Europe increased 20-fold in just 12 years. I give some examples there. From 1997 to 2008, the number of Colombians in Spain went from 8,000 to 250,000. Ecuadorians from 4,000 to almost 500,000. That's unprecedented. I mean, I have an obsession with people moving around, so I keep track of everyone that moves, it seems. And I've never seen that temporal concentration, right? Migrations usually begin with a few people, and then keeps on increasing, and it's like a growth curve. But this is not a growth curve. This looks more like a roller coaster or whatever, I mean, a very steep roller coaster, right? So from nothing to boom. That's actually something new. That I always, as a historian, I'm always arguing that no, there is not all of this stuff about global migrations and massive migration and globalization is exaggerated. There is nothing new, but there are a few things that are new. And this level of temporal concentration, from nothing to 500,000 in a decade, that's actually didn't happen before. So time has become concentrated. Another trait is that these are highly feminine movements. And from the start, that's what is also important and distinctive, is the reverse of the traditional pattern. And the pattern that actually continues to be the most common pattern today, which is that migrations early on tend to be much more masculine. And they become, as they become mature, the migration flow becomes mature, they become more balanced, and sometimes it is under a declining phase of the curve, as the migration is declining, that actually women sometimes come to outnumber men. Well, here we're seeing the reverse. This is not unheard of. It is similar to the case of the Filipinos. It is similar to some Eastern European groups, the groups that I mentioned there, Russians, Belarusians, Ukrainians. Less so for the Poles, actually. The Poles are more balanced. And it is the opposite of Pakistanis, Bangladeshis, Moroccans, Somalis, Senegalese, basically modern Muslim groups other than Indonesians, except Indonesians. And actually, of the 10 countries with the lowest proportion of women among their immigrants in the world, of the 10 countries in the world with the lowest proportion of women among their immigrants, 9 are Muslim countries from either North Africa or the Middle East. I don't know what it means, but that's a fact. Again, where the meaning is probably more complicated. In cases where this migration gets stuck at the stage of female labor migration, and this is how this begins, it stays feminine. And it's either domestic servants or sex workers who are also labor migrants. We tend to treat the migration of sex workers as something having to do with criminal studies rather than migration and movement, the movement of people. Most of these people, the immense majority of these people, are not being trafficked, and they know what they're doing, and it's a perfectly rational choice given the choices and the alternatives. It's not that rare. So for Dominicans and Colombians in the Netherlands, a lot of them actually are sex workers, and also there is a new business. It reminded me, we were in Spain, in Amsterdam a month ago, and I saw a hair salon, Chiquitica hair salon. And I began, and they were Dominican women who, instead of working as sex workers, decided, well, I'm going to supply the sex workers with some services, right? Like a hair salon. And it reminded me of people who go to mining towns, and instead of digging for gold like everyone else, puts a grocery store, and that's the one who makes the money, right? I says, actually, this is very entrepreneurial. And then masculinization, right? Where female labor migrations develops, becomes more than that, and you have family reunification, but also just chain migration of people coming, relatives, and stuff like that. Then the migration tends to become more masculine, right? So it's the reverse of all times. It begins very feminized and it becomes masculinized. And I give you some numbers there. Dominicans were 80% female in Spain in 1997, and in a decade and a little more, dropped 20%. Ecuadorians is even more impressive. In 6-7 years, they went from 70% female to 50-50. Again, more rapid. So, I mean, these migration flows are becoming masculinized much faster than all migration flows were becoming feminized. Now, I don't know if the difference is becoming feminized as opposed to, or masculinized as opposed to feminized, or is simply that concentration, that temporal concentration that we witnessed before, that everything is happening faster. And if it had been the other way around, that they were becoming feminized, probably that would have been also faster. It's impossible to tell, of course. Another trait is also shifting racial origins. The same way that we see a shifting in terms of gender from heavily female to balance, we see also a shift in racial origins. Before the mid-1990s, most Latin Americans in Europe were of European descent, either Argentines, Chileans, Uruguayans, or whites from countries in Latin America that are mostly indigenous or Afro-descendant, Cuban exiles and stuff like that. After the mid-1990s, now the majority is indigenous and mestizo, immigrants from the Andean Altiplano, from mostly Ecuador, but also the Altiplano, the highlands of Ecuador, the Andean region of Ecuador, but also of Peru, and now increasingly Bolivians. Those are the last to join the thing, but they're joining with gusto. And to a lesser degree, Afro-descendants, Dominicans, Cubans, that like Cubans in the United States are becoming of more diverse racial origin, and then coastal South America, South Americans, people from Guayaquil and the coast of Ecuador. I mean, all of the coast of South America, both Pacific and Atlantic, has a very heavy African presence. It's part of Afro-America, if you will, although the countries themselves are majority indigenous mestizo, right? This is in part a reflection of the democratization of socioeconomic origins. And again, here, this is also happening at a faster pace. It was always the case that migration flows from a particular space, usually works better if it is a microspace, a micro-region. At the early stages, particularly long-distance migration, the socioeconomic background of the immigrants is much higher than those who stay behind. It continues to be higher as time goes along, but it becomes less higher. That is, migrants become increasingly more representative of the population of origin, right? But again, this used to take a longer period of time. Here, again, is the compression of time. In a decade, people are coming that are actually of quite humble origins, although still a little better off than people back home. And I also say that this has led to a democratization of what I call a traditional Latin American markers of elite identity. That they had been to Europe, they had lived in Paris, that they had lived in London, that my daughter or my son lives in Rome. Immediately you could identify, well, this is the creme de la creme of Latin America. Well, but except that now indigenous peasants in the Altiplano can say the same thing. And actually, they have a brother. They can tell you, well, yes, that's true. My daughter is, one of my daughters in Amsterdam, another one is in Rome, but I also have one in Berlin and the other one in Frankfurt. And it is actually, the example that I was going to give was what Asane. My daughter is doing anthropological work in this village of less than 1,000 inhabitants in the middle of the Peruvian Altiplano. Well, this small village, there are people from that small village with in 7 European countries and 16 different European cities, from Edinburgh to Naples. Now, this is globalization. I mean, we should be more careful when we talk about globalization, you know, so easily. But in this case, this is truly impressive. The next thing that I wanted to just mention were contrast to Latinos in the United States, to the Latino population in the United States. Well, an obvious contrast is the size. There is 2.5 million Latinos in Europe, and I wasn't too sure. I was trying to figure out 19 million, 18, 20 million foreign-born Latinos, right, in the United States, and a larger number of that. Latinos must be, I don't know, what, 12, 13% of the population of the United States, and we're 306 million, so that's actually close to 40 million. It's actually, it's close, yeah, it's 40 million, yeah. So it's a huge difference in size still. That means also that is a very recent movement. That means that it's basically Latino communities in Europe are basically first-generation communities with small children. Very different to the case of the United States, where you have a multi-generation community, right? People who are still right now crossing the border, and people who have been here for 100 years. And 20 generations. I don't know. A perfect example is the so-called Hispanos from northern New Mexico, who actually continue to speak Spanish after 3 centuries and 4 centuries. So it's actually it must be the most extreme case of language preservation of an immigrant group in the United States. I don't know of any other. This lack of long history among Latinos in Europe will mean that they cannot use history as claims of belonging, like Latinos have long used here. You know, Latinos who always says we're not migrants. Look, we came before there was a United States, before 1776. Actually, we came 100 years before the English came. We were here already. And then the other thing is actually very common in Chicano ideology, is that that we were here all along, that we're the indigenous people of the Americas. Obviously, Latinos cannot make that claim. Maybe Basques can make that claim, that they're actually, actually that's true. That's the only non-Indo-European language that survived the Indo-European invasion. So they're truly the original Europeans. So no Aztlán, you know, no element of Aztlán. This idea of Mexicans that the Southwest is their place of origin. This idea that Aztecs came from the North. And the North is California, Arizona, that's actually, and all of that. I mean, who knows? The Aztecs came from the North, but the North could have been Chihuahua. It's not, you know, that there were national borders then. The other thing is that in the United States, I think, unlike European societies, there is this rhetoric of that we're a nation of immigrants, and at least most people say that it is much more open society, that people feel less alienated, foreigners feel less alienated, and that European societies are less open to outsiders. That's what I have always argued, but then the next slides have made me question that. This is an attitudes toward immigrants in 2007, is a Pew poll. And as you can see, this the question is, we should further restrict and control immigration. The proportion that agrees is in light brown. And in the case of the United States, it's 75% of the population. In Italy, it's much higher, but in Spain and Britain is similar, and in the rest of Europe is actually lower. So anti-immigration feelings tend to be very low among the usual suspects, people like Swedes. Although Swedes, they made a lot now that an anti-immigrant party made it to the parliament. Then I look what proportion of the vote they got. They got 4.7, and that's news actually. Not that 95% of the population voted against this immigrant. It's actually quite distorting how we phrase it, right? So I mean, there is not apparent difference here. I mean, one of the intriguing things here is that in some of the people who are more anti-immigrant are countries that barely have any immigrants. They're being against somebody that doesn't exist, actually, which is perfectly possible. African countries are actually some of them are actually countries of immigrants. Ivory Coast, South Africa, but Tanzania, I doubt it, and Mali and Ethiopia, definitely not. Unless they're talking about refugees, that could be, yeah. Now, the other thing that I notice here is xenophobia. Anti-immigrant feelings tend to increase with age. We become less tolerant as we become wiser. I don't know. So you can see that it's highest among people 65 and over. In the United States, yeah. So you can see in the United States it's 50% intensity of support of anti-immigration, right? It's 50% people over 65. Then it drops, and it drops, right? But look at the difference. I mean, our young people, 40% of our young people are strongly anti-immigrant, compared to 29% in Canada and 31% in Western Europe. So insofar as the young people are the future, this will indicate that, if anything, Europeans are likely to become less anti-immigrant than we are, since our younger people don't seem to be. These are people in between the ages of 18 and 29. It's only Italians, actually. Italians seem to be the most anti-immigrant people in most, I don't know what it is, the pasta, and maybe it's just that they're very histrionic and they will express strong opinions even if they don't know what the question was. La Lega Nord, I guess. So, yeah, now, who knows? Maybe this will be good for Sicilians. Sicilians will finally be accepted as Italians, now that they have foreigners. So, and the other thing, the last thing is that there are different targets of xenophobia in both in Europe and the United States. In Europe, basically, most of the xenophobia, and you can see it in the political rhetoric, is against Muslim immigrants. Close to Muslim immigrants is the Roma. And then after that, it's certain Eastern European groups, particularly Romanians, which also is overlap with the anti-Roma stuff, and Albanians, right? These are the people that, if you talk to Europeans, these are the people who are supposed to be committing all the crimes and taking the countries down the drain. And then the other discourse is of Muslim immigrant intolerance, particularly homophobia. In the case of the Netherlands, is that these people don't have the Dutch values of tolerance towards gays, for example. That is not said about Latin American immigrants, right? In the United States, it's the reverse. It is Latino immigrants who are the major target of xenophobia in the United States. I mean, if you mention immigrant in the United States without any adjective, the immediate image that comes to most people's minds is a Mexican, which is actually one of the reasons why, when demagogues have tried to fuse the fear of immigrants and the fear of terrorists, it's not that easy to do in the United States. Because if you said immigrants, the Mexican, An image comes and you say terrorist is a different image. It's someone with a beard looking like me and maybe, you know, something on his head. It's Middle Eastern Arabs, right? So it's two different images that are spontaneous and almost natural, and it seems that they're very difficult to fuse. In Europe, it's easier to fuse, actually, because anti-immigrants feelings, xenophobia is also Islamophobia. They're very tight. Now, this is very bad, but for Latinos, immigrants in the United States, actually in Europe, it has an advantage. If you have other targets of phobias, then you're left alone. Or the phobia that is directed towards you is not as strong because there are many other targets. So, and there is evidence that Latino immigrants assimilate easier than most other immigrants in Europe, and not only in Spain. I was reading a very interesting article about, I think it was Ecuadorian women in Belgium. Even as I thought, well, that must be because of the language. But even in the non-Walloon areas of Belgium, in the Flemish areas of Belgium, it was much more likely for Latin American immigrants to intermarry with both Walloons and Flemish people than any other group outside of European. So probably the path towards our assimilation of Latino immigrants in Europe may be closer, actually, to the path towards assimilation of the old Latin European migrants to Northern Europe. That it do. Actually, it may be probably faster, because when the Latin European migrants were going to Northern Europe, they were basically, other than the Turks, they were basically the only foreigners around. So then anti-foreign feeling was more concentrated on them. In the case of Latin Americans, it is more diffuse. Now, one of the reasons why I don't know if I finally write an article on this is that as a historian, it's very difficult to predict the future. And this is so recent that I feel very... So I was thinking that maybe I should do it with Sylvia. Sylvia will, as a sociologist, she will decide, yeah, we will say this, and this is happening now, and forget about, you know, the long durée. And so at any rate, this is where I end my presentations, and then now we can have a dialogue. So thanks.